The microphone was still live when the sound carried across the entire ballroom. A small, almost delicate clatter, metal against polished parquet, swallowed for a second by stunned silence, before someone in the back finally whispered, "Is that what I think it is?" A young woman in a designer gown stood there with her hand still extended from the shove she had just given. Her face caught somewhere between irritation and the dawning realization that several hundred of the city's wealthiest guests were now staring, not at her, but at the small object spinning to a stop near her heels. An elderly waiter froze mid-step, a tray balanced on one hand, watching the scene with the kind of stillness people only have when they sense, instinctively, that something irreversible has just happened. What had that quiet old man, dressed in a coat 2 sizes too big, done to deserve a life that ended up colliding, tonight of all nights, with a room full of chandeliers and old money? To understand that collision, we need to step back 3 weeks, to a freezing dawn outside a downtown soup kitchen, long before any of these people knew his name. He showed up every morning before the kitchen even opened, not to be first in line, but to help the volunteers carry crates of bread and stack folding chairs before the doors swung open to the rest of the city's hungry. Nobody had asked him to do it. He just did. The volunteers called him by a nickname he'd quietly earned over the months. Sarge, though he never confirmed or denied the rank himself, just smiled faintly whenever someone used it, the way people smile at memories they've decided not to revisit out loud. He wore the same gray coat through every kind of weather, a coat that had clearly been mended more than once by his own hand, the stitches uneven but careful, like someone determined to keep something intact for reasons that went beyond simple necessity. He never asked for more than his share of food, often giving part of his own portion to whichever newcomer looked the most lost that day. A quiet code he seemed to live by without ever stating it as a rule. A few miles away, in a penthouse suite that occupied the entire top floor of one of downtown's most photographed buildings, a young socialite was finishing the last details of an event 3 weeks in the making. A glittering charity gala meant to celebrate, according to the invitation, the resilience of the human spirit. She had inherited her family's name, their seat on several boards, and a fortune large enough that she had never once, in her entire adult life, had to ask what something cost before buying it. She spoke of philanthropy constantly, posted about it often, photographed beautifully beside every check she'd ever handed over for a camera, yet treated the people who built her events, the caterers, the florists, the assistants, with a kind of casual disdain she never seemed to notice in herself. To her, kindness was something performed in a ballroom under good lighting, not something offered quietly on a cold sidewalk where nobody was watching. It was on her way to a final walkthrough of the venue, 3 weeks before the gala, that she first noticed the old man in the gray coat sitting near the building's side entrance, having paused there simply to rest his knees for a few minutes before continuing on toward the soup kitchen. Without slowing her pace, without even fully looking at him, she told her assistant, loudly enough for the old man himself to hear, to get rid of that before the catering trucks arrived, as if he were a stray piece of trash blown in by the wind, rather than a person resting his legs. The assistant, uncomfortable but unwilling to argue with her employer, asked him politely to move along, and the man did, slowly, leaning briefly on the wall before finding his balance, never once raising his voice, never once arguing his right to simply sit there for a moment. The socialite didn't watch him go. She'd already moved on to discussing flower arrangements before he was even out of earshot. That single dismissive moment, small as it seemed to her, set something larger into motion. Annoyed that vagrants, as she called them in a text to the building's property manager, kept gathering near her events, she pushed through a donation to a downtown revitalization initiative for increased security sweeps along that block. Sweeps that made it harder for outreach volunteers to even find the people they were trying to help, let alone build the kind of trust that takes months to earn. The old man, displaced from one of his few quiet resting spots, said nothing about it to anyone. He simply found a new spot, a little further away, and kept showing up at the soup kitchen every morning. Same time, same quiet routine. His dignity intact, even as the world kept finding small ways to chip away at the space he was allowed to occupy in it. Underneath that quiet routine lived a story almost nobody around him knew. He had served 2 tours overseas, decades ago, in a role that asked him to make decisions in seconds that most people would spend a lifetime processing. He had come home to a wife who loved him fiercely, but couldn't reach the parts of him the war had taken somewhere he himself couldn't always find. A daughter who grew up watching her father slowly disappear inside himself, even while he was sitting right there at the dinner table. By the time the marriage ended and the house was sold, he had already begun the slow drift that eventually led him to soup kitchen lines and church basement cots, never once telling anyone the details of what exactly he had done over there, partly out of humility, partly because some memories simply refused to become words. But even in that drift, a small thread of warmth had found him. The soup kitchen's youngest volunteer, a college student earning community service hours for a scholarship application, had taken to saving him the corner piece of cornbread every single morning, the one with the most butter soaked into it. A tiny gesture she never made a big deal out of, just quietly placing it on his tray with a small smile before moving to the next person in line. He never said much about it either, just a nod, much obliged, the kind of small exchange that, over weeks, built into something neither of them ever called friendship out loud, but clearly was. It was, ironically, that very same socialite who, weeks later, decided to add a final touch to her Gala's program. A brief segment honoring everyday heroes of the city, meant to add a layer of emotional depth to an evening that was, underneath all the chandeliers, mostly designed to be photographed. Her event planner, scrambling to fill the segment, reached out to several local shelters and soup kitchens for inspiring stories, and one of the volunteers, without thinking much of it, mentioned the quiet old man who showed up every morning to help before anyone even asked him to. Nobody on the planning team realized, of course, that the man being described was the very same one the hostess had once told her assistant to get rid of outside her own building weeks earlier. He was invited, almost as an afterthought, to attend the gala as a guest, seated near the back, given a simple suit borrowed from the shelter's donation closet, told only that there would be a nice surprise for him during the evening's program. He arrived quietly, uncomfortable in unfamiliar fabric, sitting at the edge of his assigned table, careful not to take up more space than necessary, the way he always was. It was while making his way toward the restroom partway through dinner that he passed too close to the same young hostess, now mid-conversation with a group of donors, and her elbow, swinging back carelessly as she laughed at something, caught his sleeve hard enough to throw him slightly off balance. He reached out instinctively to steady himself against a nearby chair, and in doing so, the old weathered wallet in his borrowed jacket slipped loose, falling open on its way down, spilling a few worn photographs, and rolling free from a small inner fold, a tarnished metal that spun once across the parquet floor before coming to rest near the hostess's heels. She looked down, irritated at first, assuming he had bumped into her on purpose, already opening her mouth to say something sharp in front of her donors. But the museum curator seated at the nearest table, a quiet man invited that evening specifically for his expertise on historical preservation, had already risen halfway out of his chair, eyes locked on the small object on the floor. He had spent years cataloging military history for a regional archive, and he recognized instantly exactly what that medal was, and exactly what kind of action it took to earn one. He bent down, picked it up with both hands, the way one might handle something far more fragile than metal, and turned to address the table, then the room, his voice carrying further than he probably intended as the chatter around him gradually died down to nothing. He explained plainly what the medal signified, the kind of valor under direct enemy engagement it represented, the rarity of it, the fact that very few men who earn one ever speak of it themselves. As he spoke, he looked toward the old man, now standing awkwardly near the chair he'd grabbed for balance, dressed in a suit that wasn't his, surrounded by people who, moments earlier, hadn't known his name and, in at least one case, had once told someone to remove him from a sidewalk like an inconvenience. The hostess, metal practically still rolling at her feet, felt every head in that section of the room slowly turn from the small piece of metal toward her own frozen expression. It was at that exact moment that an older gentleman near the head table, a longtime family friend invited as one of the gala's largest donors, rose from his seat, visibly shaken. He asked, voice unsteady, what unit the old man had served with, what years, what region. When the answer came, quiet but clear. The donor sat back down heavily, hand pressed against his chest, and explained to the stunned table around him that he himself had served in that very unit, that he remembered even decades later a sergeant who had pulled 3 of his men out of a collapsed position under heavy fire one impossible night, an act that, as far as he knew, had never been properly recognized because the sergeant himself had refused every attempt at a formal ceremony, insisting he'd simply done what anyone would have done. The room realized, almost in the same breath, that this donor, one of the very benefactors funding the Socialite's family foundation for years, owed his life, quite literally, to the same man she had once dismissed as something to get rid of. The silence that followed swallowed even the soft clinking of cutlery being set down across the room. The hostess, used to controlling every detail of every room she ever walked into, had absolutely no script for this. She looked at the medal, then at the donor with tears now openly running down his face, then at the old man standing quietly amid all of it, asking for nothing, expecting nothing, simply existing in a moment that had clearly been building toward him his entire life without anyone, including himself, fully realizing it. The story didn't stay inside that ballroom for long. A guest's phone video, capturing the curator's explanation and the donor's emotional revelation, found its way online within hours, and by the next morning, the contrast between the Gala's official Everyday Heroes segment and the hostess's own earlier treatment of that same hero had become impossible to ignore. Her family's foundation faced a wave of uncomfortable questions from the press. Sponsors who had quietly tolerated her public persona for years suddenly found themselves needing to comment, and several chose, carefully, to distance their names from hers for the time being. The real conversation, though, the one that mattered, happened a few days later, away from any camera, when the hostess showed up alone at the soup kitchen, dressed plainly for what was probably the first time in years, asking the volunteers if she could speak with him. The old man agreed, sitting across from her at one of the kitchen's worn folding tables, the same tables he had helped set up every morning for months. She apologized haltingly, admitting she had looked straight through him as though he weren't even a person, and asked quietly if there was anything she could do to make it right. He told her simply that the easiest way to honor anyone who has ever sacrificed something for others is to start noticing the people you'd normally walk past without a second glance, and that an apology only means something if it changes how you treat the next person nobody else is bothering to see. In the weeks after, the donor whose life had once depended on that sergeant's courage made sure the old man was properly connected with veteran services he had spent years avoiding out of pride, and quietly funded a small, permanent room for him at a residence near the soup kitchen where he still insisted on showing up early every morning. Crates of bread and folding chairs included, exactly as before. The young volunteer kept saving him the corner piece of cornbread, though now every so often he'd bring her a small bag of oranges in return, the closest thing to a gift he ever allowed himself to give. What stays with us from a story like this is simple enough not to need any further explanation. Real courage rarely announces itself, rarely asks to be seen, and almost never depends on the size of the room it happens to be standing in when the truth finally catches up to it. The people most easily dismissed by a glittering room are sometimes the very reason some of the people inside that room are alive to attend it at all. So maybe, the next time we're quick to look away from someone the world has decided isn't worth our attention, it's worth asking, just for a second, what kind of story we might be walking straight past without ever bothering to find out.